A lot of what we're talking about when we talk about AI replacing jobs, and whether we're talking about knowledge work, the way that knowledge work and the way we move data around is changing, I think it comes down to the same thing, which is we're talking about automation. When you talk to people about automation, there's this misconception that in some way that it's a clean handover, that the human stops working on something and then the machine takes over. The Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, they said that AI, in 65% of these cases is removing routine tasks. In 75% of the cases that they looked at, actually created new creative tasks as a result of having an AI. So automation doesn't erase human work, it's going to upgrade it.
Welcome to the podcast, Shane. It's great to have you.
Delighted. Thanks, Nilan.
Shane, why don't we start with tell us about you and you have accomplished a lot, and tell our listeners about it.
So I grew up in the UK, and from a very early age, I was really interested in technology and engineering and computers and things like that. And so my career has really been in and around technology for the last 30 years, beginning in technology publishing, around at the beginning of the internet advertising, and then through creating some own startups of my own. So creating an advertising agency in the 2000s, moving on to creating a technology company where we developed lots of mobile apps at the peak of the mobile explosion, until more recently moving to Asia, where I was involved in large digital transformations of organizations, process redesign. So we'll be touching a little bit on that, I'm sure, today as we think about AI and the future of work. And now more recently, I'm involved in thinking about how we can use technology to really improve digital advertising, as well as working on some other projects involved in next generation sensing.
Cool. I think I knew some of those, but not all of those. But to summarize, I think you were in the forefront of all of these new waves of technology. Like advertising firm in early 2000 is like very early digital, and then mobile. How do you see this new AI wave? Do you see it as another wave, or do you see that's something fundamentally different?
Well, look, I think what you've touched on there is probably my bias.
Right.
I get tremendously excited about the potential and opportunity for new technologies. Because what history has taught us and what it's taught me in my career is we're never quite sure what's going to happen. So you touched on it, right? I was involved in internet advertising at the dawn of the World Wide Web in the late 90s or the mid late 90s, the mobile explosion in the early 2000s as we got the iPhone. And then in terms of things like process, that was a function of the big explosion we had in cloud computing technology. I think that what's interesting about AI is the debate that we're having about how it's reshaping, human work. I think that is always the big anxiety as new technologies come through. Interestingly, I think every technology revolution brings its own kind of mythology and always the wrong predictions. We can go back even as far as the Industrial Revolution. I think what was fun at the time to look back on is that at the time, the worker was promised through pamphlets that they would potentially enjoy a life of leisure. There would be no more drudgery. They would be able to indulge in creating poetry at home. Instead, the Industrial Revolution delivered longer hours. Instead of poetry, they got time cards and probably a lot of soot. So I think the big lesson to take away from there is it's less about unemployment when it comes to future work but it's more about redefinition of what work and what our output actually looks like. I think even if you fast forward, from the Industrial Revolution to the computer revolution in the late 1970s, and I'm giving away my age now, I was invited as part of a school trip to visit IBM's headquarters in the UK. I do stress I was a 7-year-old. It was part of their outreach to try to get kids interested in computing. And back then, the conversation was talking about the paperless office. So back then, we had typing pools. Everything was done on paper. Memos were sent. Mail was sent between businesses. And interestingly, by 2000, paper use had actually tripled within offices. We were printing out the emails that said, do not print these emails. So we had this still going on there. So I think it's really interesting to see that the way that we imagine things taking place and how it actually then takes place can be profoundly different. Staying with the computer revolution, let's think about networking. So suddenly we were able to connect these computers together. No one imagined that you'd be able to have a spreadsheet in New York being worked on by someone in Singapore. And I think in the same way that IBM executives that we met back in the late 70s, they could never have imagined that their customer support would one day be performed by a teenager in an office in Manila. So I think it's interesting. The World Economic Forum has a stat for this. They are saying that by 2030, 85 million jobs will be displaced by AI, but 97 million will be created as a result of it. So my view is it's not about a loss of jobs, but a shift in what we do.
So you said there'll be more jobs created than the jobs that AI will take away. Which jobs would be like transformed and what jobs will be like replaced?
I think a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about AI replacing jobs, and whether we're talking about knowledge work, where we're seeing obviously a huge explosion in the way we use LLMs in these GPT models, and the way that knowledge work and the way we move data around is changing. But also in terms of physical work, there's still this unknown about what does that AI mean for physical work. I think it comes down to the same thing, which is we're talking about automation. And when you talk to people about automation, there's this misconception that in some way that it's a clean handover, right? That the human stops working on something and then the machine takes over. That's rarely the case. In fact, it's never been the case. In fact, the word automation comes from, correct me if I'm wrong here, the Greek autos, which means self, and matos, which means acting. So I think we first started using the word all the way back in the 1940s. This was when Ford was starting to do mass production in their car factories in the US, and they were calling these self-acting machines. And the reality was that these self-acting machines were incredibly fragile. They needed to be built, they needed to be calibrated, they needed to be supervised. And in a way, I see the same dynamic everywhere now that we are now as well. So in logistics, you have automation, you have things happening in software, but it's humans that are managing the exceptions, the problems that come up in finance. You've got algorithms that are analyzing huge chunks of data, making some predictions on that data, but actually it's humans that then interpret the nuance in that data and that actually then make the decisions about what to do or how to act or what to invest in. And I think another great example is healthcare. I think recently the evidence is very clear from the research that's been done that shows that in many cases, if you take, say, oncology scans, that computers are much better at detecting the presence of cancers that are found in cells. But it's actually still going to come down to a human to decide, well, what is going to be the appropriate treatment plan for that human, and how do you communicate that with empathy? And computers can't do empathy. That's not something that is a human to human connection that humans can't replicate. The Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, I think, said, when they did their research, they said that AI in 65% of these cases is removing, routine tasks. And in 75% of the cases that they looked at, it actually created new creative tasks as a result of having that AI. So for me, automation doesn't erase human work. So AI is not going to erase human work. It's going to upgrade it in most cases.
I think you made a very interesting point there around that automation is not a black and white thing. Like
Mm.
you don't like humans do something, you stop, and the machines take over. It took me embarrassingly long time to understand that when I'm working with clients on these different types of automation projects and now AI, because that changed the game. Because the moment you understand it is a gradual process, you set the expectations right, and that leads to project success. But the moment you think, okay, I can now, these 5 people are no longer needed, there's a new software coming next week, like that kind of a thinking is going to, that never works. So it took me some time to understand that, but that's such a great point.
I think work in general is misunderstood. So let's take knowledge work. Let's take an industry that you and I know quite well, which is the advertising industry or media things. So several years ago in a company I was working with, we undertook some analysis of advertising agencies to understand the type of work that could be automated. And what we found was that there were a lot of different tasks, there was a lot of different systems that were being used. And ultimately, an advertising agency is an outsourcing of a process by a company. They put that out there to reduce their cost, to increase performance, and to reduce their risk. But what work was actually being done? So we analyzed what people were doing from when they arrived in the office in the morning until when they left at night, and try to understand how much actual productive work was being done. And by productive work, we mean decisions being made or outputs being generated. Okay, an output that creates value. So what we had to do is you had to take out time when people were sick, when they were on vacation, when they were taking breaks or going to the bathroom, when they were taking lunch, when they were having a mental break from being between tasks, when people were task switching. So in task switching, what we found is there is a time where people need to stop doing one thing, start doing another. That in that transition, that time and productivity is lost. And then there's that human to human interaction, that social networking that we do when we're in it. And what we found is in many cases, the number of productive hours in an advertising agency. Do you want to guess what percentage of total time?
It must have some shock value. So 50%.
About 17%.
Oh, wow.
So when we think of a business as being a manifestation of people, product, and process, and we think about automation as actually trying to improve that process part of things, we're really only looking at a small percentage of time that's actually made in productive work. So the reality is that when we look at a business and the impact of automation or the impact of software, it doesn't have the same type of impact that you have. A business is made up of that interaction between the business and its customers and creating value. And so much of that is done through that human connections that we make in the business that will lead to productive decisions, that lead to insights, that lead to problem solving, that lead to long-term strategic planning, that lead to insights about where the market might be going. And optimizing our processes does none of that work. So I think that that's something that we've learned as we've gone through this process over the last 30 years of trying to optimize our processes within businesses.
Fantastic. So one of your interest areas I think you talk about is edge AI. You want to talk a little bit about what it is and how that can be useful?
I think there's two parts to Edge AI. There's Edge AI is a manifestation of what is now being called physical or embodied AI. So this is intelligence that's rather than taking place within the cloud, where we send information to the cloud, it gets processed by a model and then sent back as an action or as information to a device or to a computer. Edge AI is really when we're talking about that the intelligence is embodied on a machine or on a device so it can perform a task or give that information. So it could be your mobile phone, which is doing your voice recognition. All of that is done on device. None of that is happening in the cloud. Or it could be a system within your car, which is keeping you from drifting out of your lane by giving you a lane correction warning, or keep actually activating your steering. This is done by sensors and systems that are actually on the device itself. Or in the case of robotics, these are robots that have sensors and intelligence on them so that as they're performing their tasks, they can also interact and respond to changes in their environment, changes in instructions, or the presence of people there. And so the benefit of that, of course, is that things happen straight away. There's no data round trip that's needed. You don't need wireless connectivity. You don't need the power consumption that goes with that as well. So it's part of that evolution that we've seen. Back in the 70s and 80s, computing was still on mainframes, and we transitioned to desktop, and then we transitioned to take that compute into the cloud along with our storage, and now it's coming back to the edge. And that market for, if we, let's say, look at embedded AI just there, I mean, right now that's worth about $11 billion globally. And of course, when you do these markets, it's depending on how you measure it and what type of things. But I think what's indicative is the trend, which is most forecasters think that that market is going to quadruple over the next 10 years in terms of the thing. So what does that actually mean? I think what you need to think about is, even in today's world, we're surrounded by devices that have sensing capabilities on them. Okay, we're being watched, listened, and felt everywhere. We have temperature, we have chemical sensors, we have all of these different things. And these sensors are going to develop more intelligence around them. So we're talking about a trillion sensor economy for type of scale. And I think what we're really seeing is we're starting to see these sensors being able to have these reflexes as they're able to think and act on these devices. So really, it's, if you think about edge AI, think about that it's systems and devices that are being built around AI rather than AI being added to things.
Right. How close do we think? I mean, you have your Teslas and you have a mobile phone, so it's already a thing. But do you think that's going to be the next big thing? Like, or do you think it will coexist with the cloud?
It's much closer than you think.
Right.
And again, we're at a stage now where we're looking at these incredible large language models producing text and videos and automating our systems by talking with systems. So we have this grand vision of AI. But what if I was to tell you it's more like a hand drill that can sense the torque that's needed to drill through a particular object, or a thermostat that learns your habits so it can adjust your energy consumption, or in the case of healthcare, it could be a wound dressing that's smart enough to adjust its aeration or provide other information for treatment. This is where we're going to start seeing it. So you're going to start seeing it in these much smaller moments, but at huge scale. And even though this technology is operating at the edge, a lot of this is going to be still connected. So that sensor on a factory line that's telling you that the machine needs maintenance is going to provide that information to the factory supervisor operator, so that we can have that factory operating more productively.
There is a like a counter argument to this. People saying not everything needs to be smart, and it's very common on the internet. What would you say about that?
I think there's a difference between making stuff smarter and things that are smart. So this goes back to my kind of philosophy as someone who's always been interested in computing and as an engineer. I think as engineers, there's this saying that, an engineer will spend weeks on trying to solve a very small problem to save a very short amount of time. I think there's another one that says that engineers are inherently lazy people because they're always just trying to find simpler ways and shorter ways to do things. And I think there is this notion that you can add AI to everything. And I think part of that is coming out where we're seeing in this current AI bubble as well, where we're starting to see so many of these so-called AI native applications, which are still piggybacking on large language models and things like that. And there's trillions of dollars of investment that are going into this area here, but actually the output or valuation of the companies that are creating are not, they're not creating anywhere near that economic activity. So there is a divergence in value there. And I think that speaks to this idea that people are just adding AI to something and trying to create value from it. I have the different view as an engineer, which is when you are looking to solve problems and you're using AI, whether it's in a physical sense or whether you're using it, in a knowledge or content sense, you're looking for new solutions. And what AI is enabling us to do is to come up with new solutions to persistent age-old problems that perhaps we weren't able to do. So that's kind of my belief around it. So perhaps I sit somewhere in the middle.
I agree with you because I have this nagging feeling when I'm doing software. Like any client or exec I talk to wants AI in their systems, right? Because you need AI now, and sometimes it's not about the value; it's about having AI. But I have this nagging feeling that the paradigm shift of AI has not happened yet, because I think the softwares as we know it will fundamentally change, and I'm not sure how. Like one of the things I'm thinking is, because what LLMs unlocked was that humans can now talk to computers, and computers understand humans in natural English rather than you go through a developer who understand the computer programming language. And maybe the next generations of softwares will be created by engineers, but then it will only define the boundary of what that software can do, and then people who use it can actually tell the software what they need. So all that customizations will happen in real time. So if you build a software and give it to 1,000 people, and the software will behave in 1,000 different ways. That's just one of the paradigms I think could happen, but I'm sure it will be a maintenance nightmare. But I think what we are trying to do now is, I think, is a good thing. That's the start of this, like the new change that is coming with the LLMs. We are trying to do what we have done previously with AI, but I think it has to, like, fundamentally, we have to think of this is going to change fundamentally. And I know, like, as an example, like when the internet first came around, people never thought they'll use it to find a partner or bring food to your house, right? That wasn't a, nobody's thinking that. But things will evolve, and then we'll have more and more of those AI native stuff that you mentioned, rather than trying to embed AI into where it doesn't belong sometimes.
Yeah. I think that there's a general tendency for us to do two things, which is engineers we work within our current human to machine frame of reference to do things. So let's take the example you meant, which is the early types of the internet. You know, there were some times, and I was reflecting on this with a colleague recently, where in the late 90s we visited what was then the UK's largest bookseller, WH Smith, who confidently predicted that nobody would buy books online because the human behavior was to browse books, to flick through. It was a visceral experience that people were looking for. Likewise, with apparel retailers or shoe retailers, the trying on of clothes, the checking of fit and looking at oneself. Um, these were all accepted kind of norms, and we engineered towards them. But actually, you're quite right. So, as things developed, what we saw was that the enablement of the internet meant that logistics changed. And when you had logistics and you could then ship and return products, then that created a whole new dynamic where you can, instead of shopping in a store, you could shop and try on at home and then return goods that were there. And so that paradigm shift was never anticipated by the engineers or at the time. Similarly, we were unable to forecast what would happen with the advent of social media. For us, socializing was something that was done in person. Human to human interaction was only done face to face. This idea about creating, maintaining, and developing human relationships through a technological medium would have been absolutely not thought about. So our dating apps at the time, we maybe helped us to meet face to face in person in ways that we couldn't have imagined now. So we have these virtual relationships, and I think it's the same now with AI. We don't yet know how these technological shifts are going to reshape society, and therefore what needs and applications and what opportunities are going to grow from that. Ultimately, we can't predict what the human condition will be 10 or 20 years from now. We don't know what our context will be, whether it's geopolitical, environmental, and therefore it's very difficult for us to predict what it is. So, all the predictions we have now are based on what we know, not what we don't know.
Did you see this humanoid robot they, I think, released 2 days ago, that can help around the house?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I'll add the link to show notes or the description. So that's, I think, a classic example of, without knowing an underlying architecture, I think, like edge AI. So that humanoid robot can help around the house and clean and all of that stuff. I think when there is another human, like, because we are very good at humanizing things, but then this robot can talk and kind of sort of have the shape of a human. there's a lot of questions around ethics and responsible AI and all of that. And I think some of the comments in those posts are like, what's going to happen when someone hack the robot and kill me in my sleep and all that kind of stuff. Do you have any thoughts around how engineers should approach this responsibly, or maybe marketers, or maybe business execs? Any thoughts around that, Shane?
So let's deal with the practical physical first, and then perhaps talk a little bit about the ethical part of things. So the practical physical side is we're still a long way from robots being able to complete the work of humans in so many different contexts. When we look at the world of work, about 70% of work that's done globally is still manual physical work of some description. So we've been here in the last few years with LLMs and GPTs, really talking about knowledge and creative work, that 30%. The other 70% is that physical. And there is this kind of misconception that robots can do most things. And if robots can do it, then people become redundant. The reality is the capability isn't always there. So the robots are very good at repetition, doing things that change the same, that stay the same. The problem in the real world is that's not how the real world works. The real world is chaotic. Things have changed. The real world requires common sense to navigate new situations, and that's something that robots can't do. And even in those cases where you can automate something with a robot, capability does not equal inevitability. They've got robots that fold laundry in labs. They're great, but they're too slow, they're too costly to implement. So there's the unit economics of these things kind of get in the way of the reality of that. And you start to see that robotics and automation spreads unevenly there. So that's the capability kind of side there. I guess on the ethical side, there's some real ethical dilemmas about the introduction of humanoid robots there. We are already seeing the fabric of society being really negatively affected by the personalization of each of our experiences. And so social media being the best example of that, but we're now starting to see in other areas. So social media means that my thoughts, opinions, my feelings are reflected back at me and amplified with me, and often in the most negative ways as well. So your reality is very different to my reality. Two people sitting in the same room together could be having very different experiences of the world around them through the mechanism of social media. And that fragmentation of that shared truth, that shared belief, is being held responsible for many of the issues that we're starting to see in the polarization of our debates and our politics and those things. The concern is that if we then transfer that into a kind of humanoid relationships where we're starting to create relationships with technology, what is the truth and what are the morals that relationship is based on? What is coded into that? Whose belief system is underpinning the way that humanoid robot is going to interact with you, the way it's going to guide you, the way it's going to influence you, and who is responsible for this? And so what we're seeing around the world is simultaneously with this development of these systems is this push towards ethical AI. And what we are seeing as well is we're starting to see the regulators moving more quickly than they did potentially with the internet. The internet was the Wild West and it was a free for all for many times. There was this fear that somehow if you regulated the internet too heavily, what you would actually do is you would reduce competition, you would reduce innovation. And what's really interesting when you see the closed garden example of the internet in China, has China arguably has been the hotbed of innovation, particularly when it comes to social commerce and things like that as well. And actually, if you look at the West with the dominance of Meta and Google and others in terms of advertising and the resultant antitrust cases that have been lodged there, has actually been a reduction of competition. So I think having robust regulatory frameworks and ethical frameworks are going to be crucial as we move into that. And more importantly, I don't think any of these things are going to affect the ability for organizations to innovate, to create, and nor will it have any negative impact on competition. What it does force us to do is for us to have this conversation with us as between each other to say what is the kind of world that we want to create. And remember, I said earlier that AI amplifies the human experience. So what is it exactly of the human experience that we want to amplify?